Well, thank you for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I had a bunch of notes in my mind regarding the sort of topic at hand, which was blasphemy and freedom of speech. Fundamentally, the term blasphemy, as far as I understand it, is a Latin term, right? And we really need to slow down when we're talking, when it comes to notions of religion and notions of ideas, because in being a Latin term, we've already entered into a certain historical context in which that term was appropriate and used. We have to understand whether or not the Latinization of this term fits well or is in harmony with Islam or religion. Etymologically speaking, blasphemy means something along the lines of slander. A big question for us to really consider is whether or not slander happens intentionally and whether or not it's explicit. A lot of the time, slander happens implicitly and unintentionally. Most of those unintentional slanders take place in the form of conflations, when we use one term instead of another, or use two terms that have very different histories and mean very different things synonymously. I'll give you an example. Something like religion versus theology. Those are two very different things, and they come attached to very different histories. The term theology is traceable back as far to at least Aristotle, right? And all it really means is theo and logos, right? So it's the study of first or ultimate causes. When we speak of paganism, there was still a religion at the time of the pagans, but there was no theology, right? So the pagans that worshipped Athena Athena was a physical thing, like it was an actual goddess, right? And it didn't make sense for them to have Persians worship their goddess, you see? That's where the term barbaric or barbarism comes from, is that the Greeks used to think that you can only worship their gods in their language. So anyone who doesn't speak their language, they Berber. So they're barbaric. Which just goes to show you the importance of otherness when it comes to speaking of identity and questions of identity. Within the context of this discussion, Islam has always been spoken of, at least as far as I could hear, from the perspective of Pakistan. One thing that we need to separate is Islam from Pakistan. Those are very different issues. Islam is not reducible to what's happening in Pakistan. In fact, Islam is not even reducible to what's happening in Arabia. Islam precedes the Arabic and the Arabic context. In fact, Islam precedes the arrival of the Quran. There was Islam before the Quran arrived. If you really take Islam on its own terms, Islam was, according to the Muslim tradition, is traceable back to Adam, which is the first man, right? So all of a sudden our notion of community changes, right? Our notion of what it means to be a Muslim changes. Our notion of what it means to submit changes. And that idea of a Muslim as someone who submits is not just reducible to a human that submits, it's all creatures that submit to the divine order. So all of these things matter, There's a lot of people that were quoted today, including Voltaire. And for everyone that's quoted, there's always a second person that we need to put that person into context. One of my professors always used to tell me that all great ideas come in pairs, right? We talked about Voltaire, but we didn't talk about Cicero. Cicero, for instance, defined religion in one of the most interesting ways for me. Whether or not it's true or not, he traces the etymology back of the term religion to a rereading. So all religion is not just a reading, it's a constant rereading. And if anyone knows the history of Islamic revelation to Muhammad, the first word that Muhammad is told is read. And that word is something he cannot repeat until he's told 3 times. Read. So, to the contrary, skepticism is not antithetical to religion, especially not Islam. but it's also not reducible to secularism, right? So doubt has a lot of place in the Islamic tradition and in all religious traditions. We spoke of Descartes' doubt, right? Descartes had inscribed in his notebooks, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. But he also had inscribed on his grave, he lives well who lives unseen. So, take it with a grain of salt. But there was talk of Ibn Rushd and the doubt of Ibn Rushd. But the doubt of Ibn Rushd only makes sense when seen in the context of the doubt of Ghazali. See, Ghazali writes to Ibn Rushd, and they go for a back and forth. Ibn Rushd Ghazali writes the incoherence of the philosophers, to which Ibn Rushd replies, the incoherence of the incoherence, right? But what was the disagreement that was taking place? Contrary to popular belief, the rationalism that was a part of Arabic philosophy and the medieval times was a very determinate rationalism. It was a rationalism that privileged order over everything else. And so what Ghazali was trying to do, and a lot of the theologians were trying to do, were to show that causality has to leave open space for things that it cannot explain. You cannot be certain, because it's not the presence of doubt, but rather the presence of over-attaining certainty that causes problems. And that debate between the certainty and doubt was framed along the lines of the question of miracles, right? The rationalists, because they had to explain everything through a causal order, did not leave any room for miracles. And so God, quote unquote, became subservient to the order that he created. So, with the little time I have, rather than being prescriptive about this topic and this subject at hand, I think it's just really, really important that we get the fundamentals right of what is this thing called Islam, right? There's a very famous hadith called the Hadith of Gabriel. I don't know if many people are familiar with it, but it lays out the entire process that is this religion, this entire process that is this reading and rereading. The first thing that we have to really come to terms with is this idea that religion is not something that you can put a period at the end of. It's a lifelong process. And if you are not transforming through the process of this religion, it's just ritual, right? And this is actually codified in this Hadith of Gabriel, in which we are told that Islam is a three-step process. And that process is Islam, Iman, Ihsan. Islam just means submission, and it means peace. So it is the peace that is attained via submission. It is based on 5 principles that constitute the pillars. These pillars are based on behaviors. It's very important. These are acts. Okay? So we have the first and second shahada, right? We have prayer, we have fasting, we have pilgrimage. All of these things matter, but these are all things that you have to do. You have to engage in these behaviors. So the very first thing that we need to realize is that the wager of Islam is that there exists a type of knowledge that comes from action, not just empty speculation. So once you engage in these behaviors, you can move, you enter into the fold of Islam, but that's not enough. The next stage is Iman. Iman is based on 6 creeds, which constitute the Aqidah, right? That's the Tawheed, belief in the books. The Quran mentions 5 of them by name, but we don't know how many else there are. We know there's at least 5. Angels, prophets, Day of Judgment, and Qadr, or predestination. Predestination is an interesting concept, because a lot of people fail to recognize is that in the Hadith of Gabriel, predestination is spoken of in terms of you have to accept both the seemingly good and the seemingly bad aspects of this predestination. Okay? Causes a lot of trouble, but I think that we can really talk about it very, very simply. The realm of Iman is not a realm that is up for challenge. You cannot challenge or bear witness to someone's Iman because it's based on invisible notions of faith. You can only bear witness against someone's Islam because it's only behavioral. You cannot say that you are or are not a Muslim. All you can say is you are or are not in agreement with these behavioral acts. This goes back to someone like Nietzsche, who is considered to be the litmus test for a lot of religions. And I think anyone who's gone through Nietzsche understands just what he brings when he brings his criticism of religion. He says that with notions of criminals or with notions of justice, don't ever reduce the person's behavior to a character trait or to a notion of personality. Say that the behavior that they engaged in was incorrect or wrong, but don't ever call them a bad person. Okay? Iman preserves this. It's invisible. You cannot under any circumstances judge another person's Iman. Finally, there's ihsan. Ihsan is based on two basic principles. The principles of seeing and being seen. There's a doubleness there. And the way that it's described in the hadith is that act in a way that God is watching you. And even if you don't see him, act so that you know that he is watching you, and even if you don't see him, just know, right? There's a doubleness there. There's a seeing and being seen, right? This doubleness that's part of ihsan is a very, very important question that we must address, because it is a question of governance, and a lot of people have used this idea of seeing and being seen as a notion of surveillance. A lot of governments engage in this paternalistic sort of impulse to say that you don't know what's good for you, so let me do it for you. But there's a huge difference between being a slave of God and being a slave of Pharaoh. These are all questions that we must sit down and really think through on our own. Islam does not leave any room for things like clergy, believe it or not. There is no hierarchies in this tradition. It actually places the responsibility on each and every individual to go and search. And if you cannot search, then you find the resources necessary for you to do so. And there's at least 3 in the tradition. Anyways, just to wrap up then. Once you have the visible elements of Islam, the invisible elements of Iman, and then the God consciousness, that would be something like ihsan, which is where things like tasawwuf begin. Once these are all in harmony, you have something called ikhlas, which is sincerity. And the one thing that we really need to understand is that from the point of view of Islam, something like blasphemy is not a condition of the eyes, it's a condition of the heart. And no matter how much peace is around you, or how much injustice is around you, if you have a heart that's rusted, it will be reflected in the world that you see. Fundamentally, what's most important, I find, is that with a lot of young people, there is a very encouraging move towards action. And we must keep that in mind when we're talking about Islam. It's okay to have conversations, but to speak from the pragmatic point of view, and I think that most of Islam is about pragmatism, because, like I said, the emphasis is on the doing. Belief is only that upon which we are prepared to act. If we are not